Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for attending this second webinar of the project Blockchain for Decent Working Conditions Along Global Supply Chains, Opportunities and Challenges for Trade Unions, European Works Council and companies, short name Blockchain for Decent Work. And on behalf of the project partners, let me thank all the speakers for accepting our invitation. Everyone who has been participating in our project activities already knows what blockchain is, got familiar with smart contracts, and already knows the reasons why companies use blockchain, all the pros and benefits from a company point of view in terms of process efficiency or effectiveness. And everyone already knows how consumers can benefit from a blockchain in terms of product authentication or product transparency. What is still not so clear is the pros from the workers' perspective. If and how blockchain can benefit workers, how can deliver social impact, how blockchain can promote socially sustainable supply chain. You know, the more complex and global is a supply chain, the more opaque it gets while trying to track and trace the working conditions under which a product has been made. In a global supply chain, there are several steps from sourcing, moving and transforming raw materials into finished products, transporting those products, distributing them to the end user. And there are several actors, suppliers, subcontractors, producers, vendors, warehouses, transportation companies, distribution center, retailers. We are old enough to know that audits of supply chain merely skim the surface, don't get so deep to observe and uncover violations of workers' rights, to examine sub or sub-subcontractors thriving in the dark. The last Global Rights Index of the International Trade Union Confederation on violations of internationally recognized labor rights by governments and employers documents that 85% of countries in the world has violated the right to strike. 72% of the European countries, 80% of countries around the world has violated the right to collective bargaining. 56% of the European countries. In 74% of countries has excluded workers from the right to establish or join a union. 38% of countries in Europe. In 72% of countries around the world, workers have no access or restricted access to justice. 51% of countries in Europe. Today is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Forms of discrimination, unfair treatment, sexual violence and harassment, unwanted sexual advances, stalking at the workplace are phenomena too often lived in silence by women. In Italy, less of one victim out of 100 reports abuses to the police. So we are aware how it can be difficult to shine a light and address violations of human rights everywhere, and how it can be difficult to hold the company accountable for any violations along its supply chain. But at the same time, we are aware that we need to take action and use all the available instruments to eradicate violations and to identify responsibilities in promoting fundamental human rights at work. That is equal treatment, occupational health and safety, just remuneration, freedom of association, right to organize and participate in collective bargaining, right to social protection, right to education, right to decent work, right to be protected from forced labor and trafficking, and so on. The European Commission considers blockchain to be a solution to the supply chain visibility issue. And we agree, blockchain may give visibility to complex supply chain, to the steps of global processes. But we are also in this case old enough to know that it gives visibility only to what someone decides, to the extent someone decides, or at least so far it works that way. This webinar, this webinar is aimed at exploring the starting point and identifying the way forward. That is, exploring the starting point and identifying the way forward. That is, how blockchain can help address, remediate the risks posed to human rights, including social and labor rights, both by their own operations and by those of their business relationship. How blockchain technology can foster a responsible business conduct and a social rights due diligence towards subsidiaries, suppliers, subcontractors, other business partners, as provided for in the United Nations Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights or the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Companies. We have to be honest. In every employment relationship, there is a weaker subject and a stronger subject. The weaker party is the worker, and we have to take that into account while collecting and validating data to assess working conditions or while identifying conditions to meet for allowing a transaction in a blockchain. Rights and interests of the weaker subject need to be represented. This is the reason why we think that trade unions, European Works Councils, and companies have to explore new and unprecedented avenues for dialogue, cooperation, participation, negotiation, in order to manage all the phases of a blockchain-based process: preparation phase, implementation phase, monitoring and evaluation, follow-up phase. For democracy to work well requires democracy in the workplace, and that needs the injection of the worker's perspective into managerial decision-making. At the moment, this project has more questions than answers. We are sure that some answers will be found this afternoon, thanks to the speakers, which will lead us to explore challenges to cope with and opportunities to be seized. Now, I give the floor to Sylvie Marianne from the Belgian trade union FGTB Horval, and also chair of the EWC Committee of the European Federation of Food, Agriculture and Tourism Trade Unions, to moderate the panel discussion. Sylvie, the floor is yours. Enjoy the webinar.
Thanks a lot, Stefania. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'm happy to see that we have 54 participants in this webinar. So that's a good start already. Like Stefania already said, I work for the FGTB, Socialist Trade Union in Belgium, and for the food and beverage sector. And I'm responsible for all the international and European projects from farm to fork. I will moderate this afternoon session. So first we will take the speakers, and afterwards we will have plenty of time to raise questions. But as we are with more than 50 people. We are divided in 3 pages on my screen. So some people, if they are waving, I cannot see them. So I will do my best and I will scroll through the pages. But please, if you want to intervene, perhaps it's more safe that you just put a quick message in the chat box, and we will try not to miss it. Okay, then our first speaker is Gianluca Comandini. He's from the Blockchain Core, and he's a partner from the project, and he will introduce the report on the blockchain applications in supply chain management. Please, Gianni, the floor is yours.
La parola.
Grazie Silvia.
Thank you, Sylvie.
Just a moment, I have difficulty in changing the language.
Today, I'm interested in letting you understand how blockchains can interface with
Today, I will talk about
supply
how to
chains.
interface
Today, it is
blockchain and supply
the
chain.
world of enterprises is always more focused, and it's going towards
Let's say today
Industry
we are talking about
4.0.
Industry 4.0,
That doesn't
but
mean
it's not given
that
for granted that all aspects of this
this
evolution are
are
covered
going
at
at the same speed.
We have a
We
blockchain
have a blockchain technology which is perfectly capable
able
of sustaining
to support the
technological
evolution and make
evolution and making more secure
the
and
supply
more
chain secure and more transparent in all sectors. But beyond that, when we talk about blockchain, we come to grips with a distributed system that enables the sharing of data while retaining the privacy of data in a transparent, public, fast way, and also in a certified way, while tracking and tracing the supply chain of this data. When we talk about data, data are anywhere in workers' lives or within an enterprise. If we talk about supply chain, there are various aspects of the supply chain that need cryptography of data that are traced within it. In the case of multinationals such as Coca-Cola and Levi's, these multinationals are leaders in using the blockchain technology in their supply chain. One of the aspects they have to come to terms with is the lack of security of data in smart working. Today, we are talking about smart working. We are facing a pandemic that is encouraging us to switch from fixed job to smart working. But a high percentage, or 40% of workers, when they connect from home with their own devices for smart working, they undermine the security of data of their own enterprises, because the connection from individual devices implies access to enterprise systems, portals, and data. And this is done from a non-secure device, which also undermines the security of data of an enterprise. We saw this recently. There's a world multinational, Luxottica, the leading producer of glasses. It has been hacked because hackers have penetrated the servers of this enterprise through one of the employees that was working in smart working mode. When we talk about blockchain, we can also ensure the security of this aspect of this type of processes. Coca-Cola and Levi's are using blockchain technology to do something special, to start a blockchain platform for internal auditing, so that the entire work chain and all the factories they source their products from can transparently certify that no abuse of workers is committed, that they are complying with their working conditions, and that all workers in the supply chain, also outside the company, Coca-Cola or Levi's, are acting regularly. That's a first hint at the opportunity for using blockchain technologies. For 12 years, since 2018, we have been saying that blockchain can be used in these fields, but only recently are multinationals using it, because any other certification or pseudo-certification platform before blockchain could merely report certain types of data or certify those data, but could not ensure the data authenticity or traceability, because they were all centralized technologies. That's the difference behind blockchain. Blockchain is decentralized, so it's as if tens of thousands of servers or locations worldwide control each other. So anyone who adds information can do so, but fake information will be unmasked, and the person that manages that information will be held liable. So dishonest people would have no interest in committing fraud or adding fake information, because this can be traced back. Apart from Levi's and Coca-Cola, other Italian companies are doing so. I'm part and parcel of an Italian task force at governmental level, and many multinationals in Italy are using blockchain in their supply chains. If you didn't have the opportunity to see it, I will ask Fania to share our report with all the applications that are concerned with blockchain. And I will also like to concentrate on the fact that blockchain should not operate as an individual technology. It can be matched with, it can match other technologies that are being used. For instance, before blockchain, there were artificial intelligence or IoT, but these technologies are incomplete. Companies are using IoT devices in order to measure the parameters of their workers. But beware, measuring the parameters of workers when they work is not legal today. Some of the clinical health data that are delivered to the company and monitored by the company on a continuous basis doesn't mean that the enterprise has the authorization, the permission to share those data or clinical data outside the company. Unfortunately and sadly, this process is not even controlled, and so there are hundreds of thousands of companies using wearable objects and measure vital parameters of workers by justifying this action as a better transparency and security, but these data are sent outside the company. Here again, blockchain can be useful, because blockchain can be effectively applied to supplement the functionalities of devices or IoT devices, so that the health data obtained by the company from workers should be retained within the company itself without going outside. So they could be used solely for anything that is decided jointly with the worker, and those data can only be used for the benefit of workers within the company, and they will remain there. The company will have no option to share those data outside the business organization or the supply chain. And this can only be done with blockchain. There's no other technology that can do so, that can ensure a privacy level for those data and also the sharing of those data. I want to underscore this because while we were slow on blockchain development, and there are IoT technologies that went faster, but these technologies are not totally transparent unless there's a blockchain layer, a platform and blockchain infrastructure that enables us to work on the other technologies in a secure way so that as to protect workers' data. And we can see this in the world of work and in any other sector, insurance sector, health sector, technology, and so on and so forth. And this, I feel, is an important theme to be discussed that needs to be solved. One of the early steps we need today is to train workers and enterprises about the use of technologies that would be more productive. For technologies to become secure for the protections of workers, first and foremost, through use of blockchain. So the first technology that we implemented and understood is absolutely the blockchain technology. In addition, another essential aspect is the legal aspect. Today, after 12 years since the introduction of blockchain, at regulatory level, we still have to agree between countries, at least within the EU, on how to define this blockchain technology. This is an issue that needs to be solved at once. All countries are following a single approach, but they are following up technology in a vertical way. There are countries lacking regulation of blockchain, so a lot needs to be done at governmental level, as we have done within CGIL and this work group. We need to create work groups in all European countries for them to achieve a definition, a fair, definitive definition of this technology, and a number of guidelines and parameters that should be met in order to apply this technology in the supply chains and in all aspects of the world of work and of civil society. Having said this, one of the applications that are worth mentioning for the next few years is what we call smart contract. Through blockchain technology, we can have encrypted data for a code transposition of an agreement. Usually, agreements used to be written on paper, but in the future, these agreements could be written by code. So we will save paper, but of course we will be sure that the agreement will be implemented. If you sign a contract, it's not given for granted that in the future this contract will be complied with. It's not given for granted that the contract will meet all parameters set in the agreements. Differently, there's a smart contract, which automatically executes the aspects of the agreements, including, for instance, wage increases, or achieving a level of seniority, or a bonus at Christmas time, or other parameters promised to the worker. There's no way to stop this if we are working smart contract logic, and all conditions will be met. Today, there's no technology that can do so, because unfortunately, the technology on which these type of agreements are based is technology that is called human being. And we know that human beings are no longer able to have the confidence level that it used to be in the past. By the time we solve the problem of confidence for human beings, we need to entrust our actions to technology that could not lead to fraud, it could not be dishonest. It will retain allegiance to the contractual terms, and that's the alternative, the best alternative possible. Of course, I'm prepared to provide further information after other speakers if you have any questions to cover the details of a few aspects of the technology or of the smart contract application. I have tried to summarize and touch upon all aspects in the 10 minutes that were assigned to me. And I hand over the floor back to Sylvie and thank the other colleagues.
Thank you, Gianluca, for your very interesting report. Next speaker is Yilosha Jarim from the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. She will talk about the use of blockchain to monitor working conditions in the Levi-Strauss factories. Please.
Thank you, Sylvie, and thank you everyone for being here. I think this is a perfect segue from Gianluca's talk to give a practical case in Levi's that we've been working with that he mentioned. I'm a research manager at Harvard Shine, and at Shine, we want to understand how work impacts people's health and well-being. So we work with organizations from US manufacturing firms to other corporate organizations in the US, but also global organizations such as the World Bank Group, as well as the garment industry. So today I'll talk a little bit about our work with Levi's in the garment industry. I will share my screen to talk about that case. Just presenter view. Can you see my screen? Me. Okay, there you go. There. So first of all, I'll talk a little bit about, let me just take, this is in the middle. I'll first quickly explain our approach to well-being to help clarify why blockchain is vital in moving our research in public health forward. And it has a lot to do with what Stefania and Gianluca have mentioned, and the way that we measure impacts nowadays is incomplete, and many times they're late and they're inaccurate. We are using a yes or no model, like we've mentioned, like it has been mentioned. So we are either counting for the number of audits, the number of hours, the benefits, the wages, the genders, the age. So we are assessing global supply chains with these metrics. But the use of automation, AI, human interconnectivity, information technology, all of that requires a more sophisticated approach to assessing how healthy these supply chains are, and also organizations overall or all around the world. So as we say in a VUCA world, we need to account for the complexity, the nuances, the ambiguity, and the not so obvious connections. So in our research, we look for the things that are below the iceberg, below the line. So things like work arrangements, the experience of culture, the experience of work, the values and beliefs that are in place. And that brings us a little bit of a system model, which it shows the complexity of all that's there. So I'll go into a little bit of what that is and the actual things that we assess. So relying on decades of research in positive psychology, occupational health, well-being, and just the world of work overall, we bring together this research to show the nuances and all the metrics. So So here are some of the things that we measure, the metrics, what we call regenerative metrics for work and well-being. So we look at things inside factories like learning and growth, fair wages, manageable workload, job security, zero harassment, healthy environment, physical working conditions, supportive relationships, job autonomy, work-life integration, recognition, meaningful job, as well as, this is not going, sorry. A caring culture. So besides having those things in place, is there trust, is there respect, is there fairness in the way that people are relating, the way that people are working? So again, we're looking below the line, not just the yes or no metrics, but the connections of the things, the regenerative resources that are there. And then we look at other things like Are people engaged at work? Are they happy? Are they healthy? And then in life, what is their well-being? We have a 6-dimension well-being framework where we look at happiness and life satisfaction overall, social connection, character strength, meaning and purpose, physical and mental health, and financial well-being. So like I mentioned, we bring together the research in all these topics in positive psychology and health and well-being and work, and we bring the connections that are not so obvious. We connect all the dots. We want to know what's impacting what is really happening in people's lives, in workers' lives, that is going to make them flourish or not in life and at work as well. So why do we take this well-being approach? Well, our intent is that so that today's solutions are not tomorrow's problems, right? So we don't want to keep doing all the things that Stefania and Gianluca have mentioned. And as a third party, not being an organization, we want to protect the trust and the privacy of these workers so that we can really know what's going on in their lives and their work and their conditions of work. So we need a more sophisticated analysis, synthesis than compliance. The yes or no model of compliance is not getting into all the feedback loops, all those relationships, how intense those relations are. What are the weak signals that are not yet so obvious that we need to look at today in order for us to not repeat the mistakes we made in the end in the past. And then it's direct sensing. We're asking the workers directly. We've been able to do this remotely and in person. In both cases, in all cases, management or auditors are not asking workers. We as researchers from Harvard go directly. We bring iPads if we're in person, and workers are protected with their privacy so that they can directly respond to us, and it goes to our servers, not an organizational server. And then lastly, we really want to look into what's the regenerative actions that factories, brands, everyone in the industry can take so that it's making the experience of work better for the people and not just decreasing the footprints and decreasing the harm or the hindering. We want to make it better. So we need to know all that's going on. And that's where blockchain comes into place, because as I mentioned, it's very complex. We live in a complex world, so it's a lot of data that we need to gather. And why do we use blockchain? So that we can hear from more people, we can get better data, it can be more representative, so we're not just hearing from a few. If we hear from a bigger sample, we're able to draw more significant conclusions on the state of well-being of people in this industry and all the industries we work with. We also rely less on the auditing blind spots that we've talked about here. The other point is big data. We have real-time computations and comprehensive results, and I'll show you a little bit of that in a little bit. And then, like Gianluca mentioned, it's decentralized, so it doesn't belong to us, it doesn't belong to the factory, it doesn't belong to the brand, it doesn't belong to anyone. It's decentralized and it's immutable, and that raises the trust in the process. So in the past 2 years, we've been lucky to be part of a pilot of a federal grant with the United States State Department, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, as well as a think tank, New America, also based here in the US, and our tech partner Consensus, as well as Levi's, of course, as the organization that has enabled us to test this pilot in their own factories in two different continents. So here, now finally, here's what I really want to show you is what's the result of this. So here's what is available to workers immediately after we close the survey. And if you see here, we have they're able to access all the questions. So whatever question they answer, they can go in and look at the actual results. Here's an example of the well-being, some of the well-being questions we asked, so they can go there themselves And also, as I mentioned, we bring more sophisticated analysis. So we're doing live computations, what we call the composites. So this piece of the results here, where we are trying to bring more data together to assess for the same thing. So in this case here, for example, when we're assessing for manageable workload, we're looking at several different things, and they have their individual results, but we're also able to put it in a composite score, so we have an idea how work is being managed, if it's manageable or not for these workers in this factory and other factories. So this way we can first see the comprehensive, like all the pieces of the puzzle of the system. At the same time, we're bringing synthesized analysis immediately to everyone involved. So management, workers, brand, everyone knows at the same time what these results are. And our hope is that by using blockchain to promote such transparency, we can actually move the needle, help move the needle in the decisions that need to be made in this industry across the world. So I'll be also happy to answer more questions at the end. I hope this was helpful in seeing in practice how Levi's has been working with us in getting the blockchain to work towards workers' well-being. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this very interesting testimony. I didn't see any questions pop up already, so please keep them in mind, write them down, put them in the chat, and we will give you time afterwards to raise them. The next speaker is Aida Ponce del Castillo from the European Trade Union Institution, and she will talk about algorithms and the role of trade unions in negotiating the algorithm encoded in a smart contract. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to share my presentation. Just give me thumbs up if you are able to see it on your screen. Is it on your screen? Good. Okay, so thank you very much again for this kind presentation and very interesting speeches. I will really talk about something more practical. And just a disclaimer, this is an experimental approach towards automating working conditions or very employment-related parameters into a blockchain. And it's really an experimental approach, so please just bear with me. I will do it in 3 stages. First, I will just speak very briefly about the type of agreements that we can use by in smart contracts and in using code. The second aspect will be the automating working conditions. What are the parameters and the values that you in your project will need to think about? And of course, I will close with the challenges that we need to tackle in using smart contracts for our supply chains. So smart contracts are legal agreements using codes, any type of codes embedded into a blockchain. And as any other contract, they have clauses, but these clauses are written in a computer program that will be executed automatically when specific conditions are determined. So basically you have to talk to the developer or the programmer in order to translate what you legally mean to do into a computing language. And there are various and a wide range of computer languages that are used in the blockchain. So if you're creating one, you have to get to know which language you would like to use and whether that language will be easy to embed social concepts like working conditions and so on. These contracts, as you know, are executed automatically. It doesn't mean that they are legally enforceable. So if you want a smart contract to be legally enforceable, then it will have to have certain legal attributes to make it comply with the whatever law you would like to comply it with. So basically, in order to create a smart contract, you need to be aware of the role of all the parties embedded into the blockchain, and who is going to do the coding, what is going to be the result of that deployment, etc. A draft in order to write a smart contract, certain conditions and terms need to be drafted and thought about. It's not easy to draft a smart contract when you don't have clarity on the terms that are going to be used and how the terms are going to be interpreted by everybody in the supply chain. So you have to be aware of that and make all the parties have the same level of understanding. Then someone has to review the code. Someone with enough neutrality that can go into the code and say, well, this makes sense, and it doesn't have bugs, it doesn't have errors, and it works well. And basically, this person makes sure that the code and the program translate the values that you would like to embed. You will see afterwards. Maybe I'm talking a little bit in the abstract, but just stay with me. Governance, as you know, there are a lot of type of blockchain approaches, distributed and centralized, non-centralized. But in any case, it's a good practice to have a governance approach in whatever blockchain you decide to choose, because it enables you to have a mechanism to regulate and self-enforce remedies in case troubles come up. It's like a kind of a troubleshooting mechanism for the performance of the contract. And if you want to have the contract to be also recognized in the law, it will be also very easy and advisable just to match it with the law and the jurisdiction of the countries that you would like to match up with. Sometimes people, now we have some blockchains that can be indeed amended. So it's also perhaps can be a good practice to think about an amendment procedure in order to go it if necessary. And of course, you have to think about the cost of the transactions, who is going to pay what in the blockchain, and how the costs are going to be distributed. So my task today was going to talk about negotiating smart contracts and embedding in them working conditions. And this is the second part of my presentation. So what are the parameters that for you in this European project are important to translate into a computer language? And I did a little bit of an experiment. This is my experimental part. So imagine this is your supply chain. You might like to have concepts defined like the ID of the farmer or whatever it's at the beginning of the chain. The farm information, including the location. You have to start thinking about all the parameters that you would like to embed into the blockchain. When it comes to the product or the distributor, for example, it looks very much, it looks easier. For example, in the case of the Levi's trousers, it's a pair of trousers or a jacket. It has a product name, a product specification, the cost, the manufacturing date, and so on and so forth. So it's very easy to trace that back to the actual producer of the jeans, of the textile. And a proof of that is very easy to also to embed into a proof of of a tracking. You can put a time span stamp, and then at the end you will have a proof of quality that specific Levi's jeans has a quality mark. But when it comes to the proof of working conditions, it's not as easy as proving the quality of a Levi's jeans, for example. There are some values that you would like to embed into a blockchain, like working time, safety measures, decent wage, age range, etc. If you would like to embed this into a smart contract, how would it look like? So this is my experimental work. For example, I define decent wage in a smart contract as a set that will contain at least the 4 elements: hourly pay, gross pay, and hours per week. That for me in my imaginary blockchain would be a decent wage. The same would be for the concept of social protections. You might like with the other parties to define the concepts that would mean social protection to be coded into. And if we go a little bit more further and we have an algorithm for decent wage, we see that if decent wage is less than 10, then we can say that is not a reasonable wage, so it cannot be paid to the farmer. And on top of that, we have to notify the labor authority. But if the decent wage is more than 10, then the farmer can receive the payment. So you see how working conditions can be embedded in actual code. So these are the procedures that you might like to follow. Let's look for another type of experiment, working conditions. What is working conditions for me? What is the proof of a good working condition? So in my experiment, I would include working time, of course, safety measures, age range, decent wage, and maximum overtime. And that set of elements will be the proof of working conditions that can be added into the programming of the smart contract. So now it looks very interesting. Of course, we have some challenges to tackle when we draft actual smart contracts. First of all, we have to have accurate and clean data. And without clean data, we cannot really define the values and the parameters that we would like to embed. The programming language, it does matter. It has to have a human readable code that would be able to avoid vagueness and false interpretation. A decent wage means 1, 2, and C, and that's it. And it's equal and valid for everyone in the supply chain. So that is a point to take into account. Well, of course, as any other technical solution, the smart contract needs to be checked in order to avoid potential bugs. Checks on the privacy and security of the data and the network, security of the network. And most of all, if you would like to implement blockchain into your supply chain, you would really like to make the case that it would really increase a valid option instead of taking out the certainty of the information and trust. And another aspect that you would like to avoid in embedding the blockchain is the dissolution of the employment relations or the labor law, because exactly this is what we'd like to preserve in using blockchain in the supply chain. So if you would like to a little bit know more, you can read one of our publications. And of course, as the other speakers, I'm very open to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aida. It was very interesting, and I will use your presentation afterwards because we need cocoa for the famous Belgian chocolates, and I can really use this presentation to make the supply chain more decent. Okay, the next speaker is Rashad Abelson. He's from the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct, and he will talk about the role for blockchain in responsible businesses conduct and the implementation of the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen right now. I hope you can all see the PowerPoint. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. As our moderator said, I'm with the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct, specifically the part of the team working on supply chain due diligence. As a small bit of background, before I dive into the topic and before I bring up our paper, the OECD, as many of you know, is an intergovernmental organization that developed the guidelines for multinational enterprises, which we call the M&E guidelines. These are a comprehensive set of government-backed recommendations that put the expectation on business to take steps to address harms to people or the environment, either through their own operations or through their business relationships, so through the supply chain. The M&D guidelines specifically recommend that businesses undertake supply chain due diligence to identify and mitigate these risks. And the OECD has developed a number of very specific guidance tools for companies in various sectors that instruct business on how to do this. So these guidance include recommendations, for example, on how to establish a due diligence policy, how to map out your supply chain and engage with stakeholders, how to prioritize which issues to address, and how to publicly report on your due diligence efforts. So although these guidelines are voluntary, they are increasingly integrated into legal requirements, particularly in the EU and the US. So as has been discussed at length in the last few years, particularly in the supply chain due diligence space, blockchain technology is often advertised as a grand solution to many due diligence issues with numerous potential applications, as we've heard from our previous speakers, that are linked to its properties of immutability, security, and decentralization. 3 years ago, when the excitement around blockchain was really starting to build, especially in international organizations, the OECD started an informal mapping exercise of the various initiatives that were popping up. So we have sector projects in minerals and in agriculture and in garments. And in the mineral space alone, this was about 3 years ago, we found at least 6 major blockchain initiatives related to gold, 3 related to cobalt, 3 more for diamond, 2 for tin. And the list goes on and gets even bigger and has gotten even bigger with time, especially when you start looking into food and agriculture supply chains, where there's really a massive proliferation of blockchain initiatives. So all this excitement and hype made understanding the potential for blockchain especially confusing and difficult for policymakers and for companies. So the OECD drafted this research paper to look deeper into those proposed blockchain solutions, trying to form a stronger understanding of how and why blockchain works for this purpose, what are its specific implementation challenges, and what companies and stakeholders need to think about when considering adopting a blockchain solution. This paper was developed through cooperation and feedback from a number of different stakeholders, so companies that are implementing blockchain themselves, NGOs and academics that are very familiar with the topic. As a small disclaimer, I myself am a due diligence policy expert. I'm not a blockchain expert or a technological expert. We had those experts come in to help us in the drafting of this paper. So the OECD recommended 6-step due diligence process can be summed up in this slide. First is embed an RBC internal policy into your management systems. Second is to identify and assess what are the impacts in your supply chain. Step 3 is to cease, prevent, or mitigate those risks. Step 4 is to track the implementation of your due diligence activities. Step 5 is to communicate how impacts are being addressed, so public communication and reporting. And step 6 is to cooperate in some sort of remediation when that's appropriate. All these steps are quite relevant to blockchain solutions, as I'm sure many of you have experienced, but particularly steps 2, 4, and 5, and I'll explain why now. So first, supply chains are extremely complex and fragmented. Many multinationals, particularly those involved in manufacturing, have thousands of suppliers, sometimes 10, 15 tiers into their supply chains, with the exact relationship between those suppliers constantly changing. These supply chains include both informal and formal actors and in developed and developing parts of the world. So this makes it really difficult to track where the goods are coming from, and also makes it difficult to understand who's handling the goods, what are their circumstances. So those are both key aspects that you need to know for your supply chain risk analysis. And then, as I said, due to the formal and informal nature of different actors in the supply chain and different levels of strength of governing institutions where those actors are located, it's really a challenge to ensure the accuracy of this information. And then one last point here is in the financing of due diligence activities and of addressing those risks. It's well known in this space that some of the biggest challenges in supply chain due diligence is the cost burden on informal actors to formalize their operations and to meet international standards in order to participate in the international market. So This slide talks about the process that we saw of setting up a blockchain solution. What's particularly important to point out here are the steps about identifying actors in the supply chain and getting them all to agree on a common data entry model and disclosure framework. And that's really critical for setting up an effective blockchain system for due diligence. So how do blockchain solutions propose to address these supply chain due diligence challenges? As I said, we've seen a number of solutions over the past few years that advertise and in some cases even achieve some really interesting and exciting results. With all the relevant supply chain actors mapped out and agreeing on a common cooperation framework, the blockchain can allow for faster, more secure, and potentially more accurate supply chain visibility. This in turn can lead to more easily identifying fraud and anomalies in your supply chain. And likewise, as our last speaker explained, the self-executing contracts could allow for better bankability to vulnerable groups who struggle for access to legal sources of finance. And virtual currency allows for that as well. Some really positive examples we've seen. So I know Levi's and Coca-Cola were brought up. We've seen projects that we highlighted in our paper from Volvo cars using blockchain to track cobalt in their supply chains and making sure the mine sites where they're getting their cobalt are verified by auditors to have responsible practices. Anheuser-Busch InBev, which is an alcohol producer and distributor, is implementing blockchain smart contracts in their potato supply chains that helps give farmers fair value for their products. And Hugo Boss is another highlighted in the paper. They're working on a supply chain cooperation tool to trace cotton flows in their supply chain. So all of that sounds great. Why don't all companies just adopt this technology to manage their supply chains? The answer to this question now, I think by many of you have caught on, is that if all of your supply chain actors are mapped out and cooperating, which is a necessary step in implementing blockchain, most of your due diligence challenges then are probably already solved. In many circumstances, adopting a blockchain solution would require overcoming serious hurdles related to value chain cooperation. And this includes, as I said, agreeing on a standard data model, agreeing on rules of governance, and agreeing on rules of transparency. Many companies have already invested significant time and money in their own databases and won't easily be convinced to spend significantly more time and money to adopt this new model, especially if it only affected a narrow aspect of their supply chain management. And then likewise, I think most important for us is the informal and less sophisticated supply chain actors, like, for example, home workers in garment supply chains or small farmers or small scale miners, tend to rely on old paper-based systems or very low-tech solutions before. So, adopting a blockchain solution might create extra barriers to entry for them to participate in legitimate markets. So these are really critical challenges that would take a large investment of time and money and cooperation across the supply chain to overcome, and across the industry, including potentially with competitors. So in the end, our conclusions were not surprising. Blockchain is a powerful technology with the potential to achieve a lot of good with regards to supply chain due diligence. But there was certainly a lot of excitement around the technology as a solution for all supply chain concerns, when in fact, a lot of the exact issues you need to overcome to adopt the solution are the same systems that you would have had to overcome even without blockchain. So it's critical that anyone considering adopting a blockchain solution keeps in mind that blockchain-based traceability cannot replace on-the-ground supply chain due diligence and stakeholder engagement. While blockchain can help companies more efficiently detect difficult to catch anomalies in their supply chain, a blockchain cannot find and report on other risks like human rights abuses. For that, you need on-the-ground engagement. People on the ground and reporting their findings could still, as I said, be necessary depending on the situation. And then another important finding is that in order to avoid barriers to entry to some of the most vulnerable supply chain actors, value chain cooperations should really include multi-stakeholder representation. So workers' representatives, representatives of local communities on the ground, civil society organizations, and governments really should be involved in this process when setting it up. So that's it. I can send around a link for more information if you'd like to read our report or see of our other due diligence tools. Thank you.
You are unmuted.
I think you're muted, Sylvie.
I'm so sorry. I will try.
No problem.
Thank you so much for your participation in this webinar. It would be very useful to have more information and links to the projects you have. The next speaker is Bernard Rijnsberg from the University of Glasgow and the School of Political and Social Sciences. And he will talk about how distributed ledger technology can help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to share my views on unlocking blockchain for sustainable development. My name is Bernard Rijnsberg. I am a lecturer in international relations at the University of Glasgow here with an avid research interest in international institutions. In the following 5 minutes, I'd like to share with you some insights on how relevant research has mapped blockchain use cases onto the Sustainable Development Goals. Then how blockchain can be harnessed for a transformational change in global governance based on my own recent research on this topic, and what all that means for advancing decent work. So I'd like to begin with a quick summary of a recent paper by Rocamora and Amelina on blockchain application and sustainable development goals. And the authors really here, what they do is to map out various blockchain use cases that currently exist in the sector onto the 17 SDGs. And they come up with use cases across 4 sectors. So for instance, in the financial sector, we would talk about cryptocurrencies, mobile money, CBDCs. In economic development, you would talk about provenance, fair trade, supply chain and supply chain finance, as we've heard from previous speakers here. In the public sector, it's all about secure access to public services through digital identity, such as health, education, land titles, intellectual property, and so on. And also in climate change, we see a new ecosystem emerging from, from the prevention of double counting of emission reduction credits to, managing smart grids. So there are indeed many use cases now that use blockchain, not only in the advanced world, but also in developing countries, where I think they have particular potential to substitute for weak institutions. So what came out of their analysis here is that, well, and that's the good news for you, I think, that blockchain has already a lot of potential and has been applied fruitfully in the area of decent work. So SDG 8 seems to have high potential when it comes to applying blockchains. How can blockchain now help achieve the SDGs depends on which of its functionalities are used. Most existing work or most existing solutions for sustainable development leverage, however, only the transparency related benefits of blockchain, right? So bringing data on the blockchain and making them securely shareable and accessible in a decentralized fashion. Deployed in this way, however, the technology remains underused and below its actual potential to induce transformational change. What do I mean by that? Well, could we not use the technology to facilitate bottom-up activities to help reshape our global economy into a more sustainable one that is economically more sustainable, putting emphasis on the long term and on stakeholders, not shareholders, socially. So can we boost labor standards? And environmentally, so can we make good on the commitments under the Paris Agreement? Now, to accomplish transformational change, I have, done some research and looked into various blockchain-enabled governance functionalities. So we really need these governance functionalities in order to make, more significant progress than we have in many of the existing use cases. And I'd like to share with you, or I'd like to cover 3 of those functionalities. The first are smart contracts, which are simply computer programs running on top of a blockchain. And these can execute arbitrary state transitions. So thanks to Dorothy here, who already has really well introduced these, so I can keep myself very short. The second one are dApps, which really are combinations of smart contracts for tailored functions. Yeah. So one example here would be a blockchain-based prediction market, which would allow for crowdsourcing new information, where reporters get rewards for contributing information that can, help make systems more efficient and trusted. And the last one and most complex of these governance functionalities are DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations, which are self-governing entities with dynamically evolving governance rules. So they have inbuilt mechanisms even to change the way that decisions are being taken within such governance systems. So to illustrate how this works, let's consider now how we can transform current structures governing climate change into a blockchain-based governance system. And let's just simply assume that we can, in a first step, get states to devise all international treaties, such as the Paris Agreement, as smart contracts. So exactly following the steps that Dorothy has outlined already here for translating legal commitments into smart contracts. And of course, all states really should participate in order for this to make sense. But where the real power comes from is by combining these commitments, or intertwining these permissioned blockchain by states with the sprawling ecosystem of permissionless blockchains that are already existing in the sector. So when we think about climate change, of course, we have a lot of activism by local actors, cities, companies, NGOs, who buy up carbon credits and so on. So there's a lot going on, but somehow these initiatives are isolated and not connected to these global governance commitments. Yeah, and a blockchain-based governance system through smart contracts can essentially navigate through these various interactions and make them all traceable. So what I propose in this paper here that is forthcoming in International Theory is a climate decentralized autonomous organizations, where basically states, international bodies, companies, NGOs, unions, and individuals can be members. And where the interactions would be governed by a common token, let's call it Greencoin, right, which would allow climate commitments by states to be linked to actions in the flourishing ecosystem of local climate initiatives. So for example, we might just think that, planting trees could be one of those initiatives, to help the climate, and everybody who plants trees could earn green coins. And for these green coins to have value, states will have underpinned these tokens with real monetary commitments. So you can easily think how such a blockchain system will advance climate governance. So I would like to summarize 3 promises using such a climate DAO. So first of all, of course, boosting transparency. This is not only because, this is simply a ledger that makes all information virtually untamperable, but also by tapping new sources of information through blockchain-based prediction markets and other decentralized oracles. So we have a lot of talk about Internet of Things, right? So these devices that report back constantly information, but also social oracles, right? Where people are being incentivized to report truthfully on local action on the ground. And that is crucially important, of course, if we think about, you know, compliance in the context of climate change activities. A second function would be to enforce commitments. And this relates to, you know, a unique function of smart contracts, which cannot be stoppable and which will enforce if the predefined conditions are met. So for these smart contracts to work, you need to underlay them with stakes. So, you know, either actor like powerful companies or states will have to make stakes to make their pledges more credible, and you know, everybody who means well and who really, you know, wants to have their pledges be credible will make such stakes. And the third one would be to increase climate ambition, namely by allowing for new pacts between civil society to buy pro-green state policies, really, right? So you might have heard about Microsoft, who has pledged to go carbon negative. Now, obviously, if Microsoft was ready to pledge some money with this, then this could support, you know, local initiatives to green the economy and so on, right? Okay, but of course there are also some challenges. I think the most fundamental one is to get all the relevant actors on board, because powerful actors might not have incentives to join such a system that constrains them in this way. But I mean, of course, there's still some technical challenges which I expect, you know, will be solved. Blockchain, after all, is still a new technology in its infancy. But I think more fundamental are the political economy challenges. And that ties in with what Rashad already said, that, you know, if you already have a well-working system and where the incentives are in place, you probably wouldn't need the blockchain, right? So there might be some reason why, you know, there are obstacles to adopting a blockchain solution in the first place, you know, such as powerful lobbies, if you think about climate change, right? Powerful states and so on. But also there's a social component here that people need to be, or need to accept to be governed by algorithms, because that is what these smart contracts ultimately mean. Okay, so in the last minute or so, I want to, you know, quickly show how we can harness blockchain for decent work, building on the experience, you know, I have done for the climate governance area here. So I think the first area would be corporate social responsibility, where simply due to the transparency that the blockchain affords, firms would be better able to communicate towards external stakeholders, you know, how well they respect labor rights in the value chain, or, you know, what they do to, you know, to offset their environmental footprint. And all of this will be much easier to verify because of the blockchain. So this will give a big push to CSR. A more fundamental purpose could be supply chain transparency, where workers will have an active role actually to provide information through, for instance, blockchain-based oracles to help ensure the integrity of the supply chain. So workers could be rewarded for providing critical information on, you know, various points of the global value chain. And last but not least, I think there's potential for enhanced corporate governance and democratizing corporate governance, you know, really following this idea of the decentralized autonomous organizations, where everybody would have a certain allocation of tokens, and workers can use those tokens to participate in the formulation of corporate policies. So to really vote for those proposals that, you know, have potential to ensure the long-term development of the firm in an economically, socially, and environmentally friendly manner. All right, with that, I conclude. So I think I've shown that blockchain technology offers a new governance modality to tackle collective action dilemmas. Blockchain-based information sharing is already among the most used functions and saves transaction costs. But we need to go beyond that, really, and use blockchain-based governance, as this could have implications for, you know, how we all come together to shape a more sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard, for your very interesting elements in this blockchain. For example, the climate, we can't live without it. Saskia Wilkes will be the next speaker in this panel from Businesses and Human Rights. She's a researcher and she will speak on mandatory human rights due diligence in supply chains and the rapidly shifting regulatory environment, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I'll try and share slides from here as well. Has that worked? Can everyone see those? Yeah, so thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today. It's a pleasure to be here. So I work for the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. We're an international NGO that works with everyone to build transparency on corporate behaviour and international standards for human rights. And as we mentioned, I've been asked to speak about the regulatory environment for due diligence in supply chains. I'll really be focusing on the environment that I can speak to, and I should perhaps also add that I'm no blockchain expert, so that's probably the only time you'll hear the word blockchain from me today. Before I go into detail, I just thought it would be worth pausing for a moment to go over some of the concepts that I'll be talking about. Forgive me if any of these are obvious. So as Rashad also laid out earlier, human rights due diligence is the sort of key instrument for companies to manage their impacts on human rights. The concept was established by the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights, and under those principles, businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights, and human rights due diligence is really the process by which they put that into practice. Something else that I think is quite important to point out here, and what the UNGPs also do, is also that states really have a duty to protect against human rights abuses by business. And that also means setting out the right legal and policy framework, including legally binding measures, especially where voluntary measures have gaps in human rights protections. And that last point is kind of really key, because I think that's really what we've been seeing across the board. Recent research over the last few years has consistently shown that voluntary implementation of due diligence by companies is insufficient and is ultimately failing workers and communities in global supply chains. To name just one example, the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, which looks at how global companies are implementing the UNGPs, found that in 2020, almost half of the 230 largest companies in the sectors really with the highest risk of human rights abuse scored 0 on every single indicator for human rights due diligence. And it's really for this reason the movement, especially in Europe and the EU, to introduce these laws that legally require business to respect human rights and undertake human rights due diligence. So mandatory human rights due diligence laws that we've been talking about. So this map gives a sort of overview of developments in Europe. You might not be able to see all the details, but I think what this really does show is that there's a lot happening in a lot of different countries in Europe. I'll start with the EU perhaps maybe. So as many of you probably know, in April this year, the European Commission committed to introducing mandatory due diligence at EU level in 2020. And they've also just launched a public online consultation to get input on how to draft this proposal. And MEPs are also working on developing a European Parliament position on what such a law could look like, which we'll aim to finalise by the end of this year. Development really came at a very crucial time in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has had really devastating consequences for so many people across the world. And I think that's why this legislation or this announcement was so important, as EU legislation can really provide stimulus to other efforts, especially national efforts, and really help on and build on these and harmonise these efforts to achieve impact. We already have cross-sectoral regulation in place or under discussion in a number of other European countries, such as France, Germany and Switzerland. So I'll just zoom in on a few at the moment, which I think are quite interesting to talk about. So especially France already has such a law. So in France, large French companies are already mandated to publish and implement a plan to identify and prevent human rights risks. And importantly, this law also includes judicial mechanisms. Failure to comply with that law has caused harm. So those harmed can bring action before a court claim remedy. There are currently 3 cases which are subject to legal action, which are under investigation at the moment. I do think it's perhaps a little bit too early to take full stock of the impact that this law has had. And one problem in particular, I think, is that it only covers relatively few very large companies. But the French law has definitely really helped move that needle in the right direction. Switzerland is holding a public referendum this week, actually, so this week on Sunday, on a mandatory due diligence proposal, the Responsible Business Initiative. And if the population votes in favour of this proposal, this would introduce mandatory due diligence requirements for all Swiss companies, except small ones in low risk sectors. And this proposal also includes possible liability rules. In Germany, under the current coalition agreement, the German government is introducing mandatory due diligence at national level and is currently preparing to pass key points for German law. And in addition, as the map shows, there is civil society action and/or initiatives by parliamentarians, commitments by governments to review legislation in at least a dozen other countries in Europe. And many of these initiatives are also supported by business. So I think that's also quite an important point to make, is that businesses themselves are increasingly also supporting these regulation or regulatory efforts. They're recognising that such rules really do provide legal certainty. They create a more level playing field, especially so that companies that are already taking steps to implement these due diligence processes aren't at a competitive disadvantage. So I think when we're looking at the regulatory environment for due diligence in Europe, it's safe to say that these laws exist. And that businesses will have a binding obligation to respect human rights, to show that they have taken action to identify human rights risks and taken preventative action. And importantly, that they're also held accountable when they do not do that. Just I wanted to quickly touch on some of the key asks from our and also civil society point of view, just to name a few. I think a really key one, and others have also touched on this, is really the involvement of stake and rights holders in the legislative process, the legal text, and also the implementation of these laws. So the law should really ensure rights holder involvement at all stages in the due diligence process and remediation. To be effective, mandatory due diligence itself needs to go beyond a mechanical or superficial tick box approach. So due diligence isn't itself, and the law really needs to allow for that as well. Access to remedy for victims of abuse is also key, and liability is one avenue for that, as well as really central to providing strong disincentives against abusive practices. And I think without liability, without teeth, there really will be no playing field that we're trying to see through these laws as well. And finally, I think it's also important to look at the wider context in which these shifts are taking place. So for example, reviewing EU trade and investment policy could also really further strengthen the potential of these mandatory due diligence laws. I'll leave at that for now. I'm also happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Saskia, to give an overview on the due diligence laws in Europe. And we all hope that we will very soon have a law on a European level. The next lady that will take the floor is Raffaella Riggi from FISAC CGL, and she's also a partner of the project, and she will talk about sustainable finance and labor rights.
Buon pomeriggio a tutti.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for your invitation. Let's check if the slide works.
Ok. Allora, buon pomeriggio a tutti, grazie. Vorrei usare questo spazio per
So
parlare un
used
attimo
my
con voi
time that was
su
assigned to me
quanto sia
to
rilevante
talk about
l'applicazione
the
di una due
importance
diligence nel
of
settore
due
finanziario
diligence in
per
the
fare il
financial
lavoro
sector for which I
in
work.
particolare in riguardo alla finanza sostenibile.
With regard to sustainable
Sto
finance, which is a
anche
theme
con
I am
Finance
developing with
all'interno
the
di quelle che sono le
Uni
strutture
Europa
europee,
Finance with the
lavorando
European
appunto per la
institution,
CGIL
as I'm involved on behalf of FISAC in the
Vorrei
international
capire quindi e
department.
ragionare con voi su
So
quello che sono le
we will
criticità
talk
e le
about
opportunità offerte da questo
criticalities and
strumento
opportunities
e
offered
come
by this
individuare cosa sia
instrument
realmente finanza
in order
sostenibile.
to identify what is
Tutto
meant by
questo in
sustainable
base a quello
finance.
che è il ruolo fondamentale della
This also
finanza
relates to the role of finance.
che come tutti sappiamo
As we all know,
flussi di
finance
capitale.
manages
Il
capital
ruolo della finanza è
flows.
quindi quello di
The role of
raccogliere i
finance
messaggi
is
dei
to
consumatori,
collect consumers'
trasformarli in
savings
prodotti e
and
servizi
change them
finanziari
into
e
financial
quindi
products and services and
l'economia
support real economy.
È utile quindi passare da una logica
It might be helpful to shift from a mere profit-based logic of finance or creation of value for investors to policies supporting social economic development. One is inclusive and respectful of the environment. How to create value not only for investors but for society as a whole.
L'attività produttiva all'interno di un mercato globale
Within a global market, such as today's, production activity is complex. As we saw, it is complex in the organizational structure of enterprises. There are many transnational elements going beyond national borders and legislations. There's also complexity in supply chains after the relocation processes that we have witnessed over the last few years. And there's also complexity in the relationship between parent company and various supply chains and subsidiaries because we lose contact with the production process because the parent company tends to connect to the first supplier's chain through a product and service agreement that only governs the economic aspects without covering policies put into place by all players in the production process. So within this complexity, we can hardly assess where to invest and how to invest. So market players and workers in the banking sector and civil society as a whole need to be better involved and be aware of this mechanism. They need to be aware of the power of the financial sector in its management of capital flows, in its management of investments, to know where consumer savings will go. It also implies a great deal of responsibility. For this reason, a due diligence is needed in the finance sector as a response to consumers' needs, because consumers need to know where their savings are going. There's also the need to respond to requests of workers in the finance sectors who need to be aware and aware of and control what they are selling to their customers. So there's a request for transparency and duty of controls vis-à-vis investors and financial institutions.
cosa dove è necessario andare a tutelare, come tutelare.
Where is it necessary to protect the world of work through due diligence? If talking about workers' rights, we also need to consider human rights, namely inalienable rights belonging to human beings as such as the right to life, to education, ban on torture and genocide. And all these values need to be translated in the working context. So freedom of association, right to strike, right to collective bargaining, ban on forced labor, child labor. Today it's the 25th of November, celebrating the non-discrimination against women, and ban on harassment. So protection of the most vulnerable groups. But we shall not confine ourselves to human rights and go beyond. If we want to talk about workers' rights, we also need to talk about a healthy working environment. So production activity shall not hamper the environment in which workers live. As we know, the right to water and so the pollution of waterbeds that derives from the non-application of environmental standards in the production by the supply chain is a fundamental right, especially in less rich countries. So there's a strong link between human rights and environmental rights, and we need to be aware of it when we talk about green transition. In addition, the pollution of the natural environment by production activities has a negative impact on communities that have closer links to the environment, including the Amazon population that see their society or their culture and civilization threatened due to the felling of trees for the production of palm oil. And another question that derives from the over-exploitation of natural resources by production activity is waste management. Hence, the need to avoid creating disadvantages for the most vulnerable social groups. And waste can also become part of a circular economy, so become part of a production cycle. What do we need for business to go towards the direction of creating value for society as a whole, rather than merely an economic return for investors? So for a positive impact for society as a whole, hate from the UN agenda of we desperately need a due diligence that needs to be compulsory, mandatory. We need to work on agreements between parent companies and suppliers. We also need short supply chains. We need a better involvement on ethical themes, and in particular the theme of human rights, green transition, respect for minorities, and circular economy. In finance, this is called sustainable finance, and it also relates to the compliance with ESG principles, environment, social, and governance principles, which aim at creating a positive impact from an environmental, social, and governance standpoint. We mentioned the social aspect, but regarding governance, there must be democratic dynamics within an organization, absence of corruption, and a fight against money laundering. So a number of practices that are banned in some parts of the world but are not in others. These ESG principles should not remain a brand to achieve the most sensible consumers. These ESG principles need to be intertwined. It is meaningless to aim at environment protection while leaving aside social and governance aspects, for instance. So we need to avoid greenwashing. So basically painting green what is not green. So coming to terms with apparently sustainable products, but with a single project, these products actually support companies and enterprises with non-ESG policies. An example of the relationship between workers' rights and green investments is electrical mobility. We know that European and national institutions are implementing their policies to support electrical mobility through the issue of green bonds to favor this type of transition. Now, to refer back to the 2015 Paris Agreement to achieve a limited level of emissions needs to be reached by 2030, and batteries are also made of metals extracted from Africa, Congo in particular. They are processed in Southeast Asia, and products are sold in European and US markets, as you can see from the map. As denounced by the Financial Times, the increase in the demand for cobalt in Congo caused the proliferation of illegal mines, small mines, but they are non-regulated, and they exploit child labor most of the time. So we tend to buy green products, so we are in favor of these products, but we don't realize that we exploit child labor away from home. And if the single bits of the production chain are reconstructed, we can trace back this system of sustainable finance. It might be helpful through blockchain to apply this to enterprise due diligence. Another example is financing of war by banks. These are just a few figures that are reported, but perhaps you can check details in this survey called Don't Bank on the Bomb, dating back to 2018 for in-depth discussions. To conclude with, we are in the year of the COVID-19 pandemic, and therefore we need to listen to what the world is requesting, what the world is asking of us. There's a connection between economic growth and safety life. So we need to target long-term growth policies, and finance need to accompany this process. Thank you for your attention, and I wish the proceeding success.
Thank you, Ayala, for giving us your point of view on the blockchain. I saw in the meantime that Bernard has put a link in the chat box to his paper, so you can all give it a look. And then we already arrived at the last speaker of the day, and it's Giorgio Verrecchia. And it's an expert on the project on labor law, and he will talk about the relationship between blockchain and GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation, from the point of view of the workers.
Buon pomeriggio a tutti, grazie dell'invito. Non so se si vede la slide, va bene, si vede, grazie.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. Don't know if you can see the slide. Yes, okay. I won't talk for long because I realize I'm the last one, so I have to be faster than the other ones. The topic I'll talk about is the relationship between blockchain technologies and the General Data Protection Regulation. First element I'd like to mention about this is that there isn't a division between compatibility and non-compatibility of the data regulation. What I mean is that since blockchain technologies are actually sets of technology, to evaluate compatibility, we must look at blockchains when they are applied to the technology that we want to actually obtain. So if we think about labor laws are based on the asymmetry of the relationship between employer and employee. Therefore, compatibility of blockchain is present, I think, in my opinion. We must take into account that could be instead absent in a commercial contract. Therefore, it's not possible to verify various parts of the relationship. While in labor law, there's absolutely a compatibility, because if we think that the worker, the weaker part of the relation, we must think that blockchain technologies tend to balance this relationship, rebalance the relationship. So what's the starting point? The privacy regulation that we all know about. So this European norm that extends to all member states without necessity of being directly implemented, it protects personal data. Personal data is not a static thing, it's a dynamic thing, and it extends based on the typology of the content that it's covering. So this personal data is protected. The concerned person doesn't give its consent. If the concerned person does give the consent, and we apply this to labor law, so a labor contract, let's imagine that an employer and a worker give their consent to divulge the contract, and therefore the data that's contained within this contract. In this case, the labor contract and blockchains would help the parts to include transparent clauses. This was already said by the people that speak before me. So if we look at the regulation on data protection, we see there's a right to rectification. This is actually made easier by blockchain technologies. As Comandini was saying at the beginning of this meeting, we can actually verify there is a false or wrong information and correct it during the subsequent process. So there's this right to rectification within blockchain, and this is not impeded by the technology. It's actually made easier. And also, let's think that European laws, when European laws foresees certain informations that are mandatory when building a working relation, and this is absolutely compatible with the privacy norm. Let's think about the directive on the transparent working conditions. This is a directive of 2019. It's about to be implemented in member states. What does this directive say? It says that a contract must contain certain information, and this information is essential for workers to organize how this worker has to actually perform his working activity. And this kind of information can be considered simple within a normal, let's say, contract, but it's important to strengthen this kind of information when the contract is agreed upon in a precarious situation. So let me make an example. For example, the workplace, the nature or category of the working activity that has to be performed. When does the actual work starts? When does it end? If it is a fixed term employment relationship, and other rights such as right to education, remuneration, what kind of collective agreement is applied to this working activity. And so what I'm trying to say here is that all these information, when they are included in a labor contract, the blockchain technology, these are certified automatically. So we have the possibility to, through the data that's included in this contract, we don't have to see European law as a separate thing. These laws actually foster the communication of this information. And another right that seems to be in opposition to blockchain technology is what is defined as the right to be forgotten, right to erasure. So first of all, we must consider the ratio of the norm. This norm has been written from a commercial point of view. The European lawmakers see the relation between the consumer and the multinational enterprise as a commercial relationship, while the first two articles, 2 points of this article are very specific and regard only relationships of commercial nature. But let's think about implementing this to a labor contract, and I'll show you this later. And then if a contract is followed by a series of safeguards that are included in this relationship, because as it has been very well explained before me, today working relationship includes supply chains and social securities and safeguard of health and safety on the workplace, participation of trade unions, and certification from trade unions. So there's a series of subjects that are part of the working relation and complete this working relation. In this case, when can we ask to erase certain data? When information is no longer necessary. So if we don't have the necessity to use a certain kind of information, that information should not be used. And at least today, in the complex kind of labor relations that we have in our society, which is a very complicated and complex society, it's very difficult to find a work relation that doesn't need that information anymore. So this would make the first point moot already. But there's also another reason. That is when the legal bases are no longer present. So obviously in that case, the person has the right to erase the data. But the norm on privacy kind of permits a certain exception. And it says, if you take into account the available technology and the costs, because we know that most of the requests to erase data have costs that are too high. So in a work relation that is transparent and where the working conditions are decent, there shouldn't be, except if there's a problem, a legal problem, there shouldn't be the need to erase data regarding the working relation, because I imagine a working relation more or less as you are seeing it right now in this slide, the series of models, more or less in member states are system that's no longer the relation between employer and worker employee. It's a relation that is very flexible, and there's a need of social guarantees. So next to the employer and the employee, we will also have a system of social security. We'll have trade unions, and trade union all over Europe and Italy and other European countries participates, and it has a function of not only negotiating and bargaining, but also certifying labor contracts. So imagine, for example, the project we're working on, for example, Open Corporation. It's a project that evaluates multinational companies. So there's a study and a research on multinational companies to assess their accountability, their reliability, their transparency, and their compatibility with labor laws. Not only this, imagine also the norm on privacy provides for the possibility for all these subjects that you're seeing in this slide to create codes of conduct. And these codes of conduct make the norm compatible with a specific topic that that one goes to talk about. So possibility to utilize the norm regarding privacy and the norm with an agreement that could be an agreement regarding the management of the personal data. A labor contract should be more or less, as you see here, there's a proposal from the employer. Once that this contract has been accepted, there's the social security system, there's vocational training, which is managed by the trade union or bilateral institutions or schools. And there's phases where problems could arise, and these phases could be certified by blockchain technology. So the next step could be what in Italy we call Cassa Integrazione Guadagni, a redundancy fund. So an incentive, a fund that could guarantee remuneration during crisis periods. And these crisis periods could cause collective redundancies. So we must agree upon the criteria. These criteria could be determined through blockchain technologies, would certify this criteria, so guaranteeing there's no discrimination. So once a person is laid off, there is a system to determine what kind of remuneration and safeguard he would benefit from. And this technology could help tracing this kind of safeguard. Also, in case of termination of the working relation, because one reaches the pension age, retirement age, this could also be certified by blockchain technologies. And these are all examples of the various steps that could be improved by blockchain technologies without this being incompatible with the management of personal data as foreseen by the regulation. But what is the difference between compatibility and non-compatibility of the regulation? In this case, there is public and private management of the blockchain technology. Therefore, All information included is information that protects the worker and guarantee a transparent working relation. But when is it instead impossible to use a blockchain technologies in a working relation? There's the evaluation phase, so the personal aspects of the working relation. Imagine disciplinary sanctions, for example. In this case, it wouldn't be possible to use blockchain technologies without damaging the right to dignity of the worker when performing his working activity. Thank you for the excellent seminar, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Giorgio. It was very interesting to have you here. It's a complex regulation, and but it's very necessary in the blockchain process. So with you, we came to the last speaker of this panel. I want to thank all of the speakers to keep their eye a little bit on the time. So now we come to the moment that we can answer questions. So please, if you have a question, raise your hand, put it in the chat box, and first indicate who you are and to whom you want to ask that question to. I saw that there was already a question from Michaela Albaralo concerning due diligence in Spain. Do you want still say something more about it, or is it fine like this? I'm searching you in the screens. It's okay. So anybody else who want to take the floor for questions? For now, I don't see any hands, do I? Somebody? No? Do I miss somebody's? No. Okay. I think it was very clear. Does somebody want to share any experiences they have within blockchain? Some panelists just want to ask questions to other panelists.
Yes, do I unmute myself? This is Aida. Can I? Yeah, thank you. Yes, I just turned my video on, so it's easier and more friendly. I would like to raise a question to the last panelist. Maybe he would need interpretation. And my question would be, well, I enjoyed your presentation on GDPR very much, and I don't think it is a complex regulation. On the contrary, I think it's a very practical regulation. The only thing that we don't need are the actual formulas in which it should be implemented, particularly within a blockchain. But I think it gives a lot of margin of maneuver for citizens or users in order to use all these new rights that we have and that we need to really exploit. But my question would be more practical. Do you know any blockchain example that would have a nice embedded of GDPR principles and rights into it? An example could be fantastic to know about. Thank you.
Mi sentite?
Can you hear me?
So can you hear me? So certainly.
Let me say something precise about the beginning of my presentation. Probably in other subjects, there are examples and there's more conflict and less compatibility. Let's go back to the point I made at the beginning. In commercial matters, when, of course, we consider the case of copyrights, clearly the compatibility with the use of personal data is more marked. But there I have no examples of contracts, of labor contracts or employment contracts that are incompatible in the blockchain environment. If we draft a labor contract as a contract that is formed by a progression of protection levels or related blocks, I can't see the information in these blocks as incompatible, although there's no regulation on labor contract. But this is not incompatible with GDPR. It rather offers forms of protections for transparency and for certification, which workers are seeking, but have no examples of this type. From a commercial point of view, if I purchase the house of another panelist, probably at blockchain level, we will have some problems with the processing of personal data. The same problem applies to the supply of specific materials. Nevertheless, in the labor contract, if we start from the need to protect workers, the more transparent is the labor contract, better it is. From the point of view of supply chain, you can verify that a given enterprise has perfect contracts, and the enterprise has the advantage of telling the purchaser, I have perfect contracts. I restructured my company in 2020 after the pandemic, and in 2021 we grew twice as much. So in that case, there are no personal data that are incompatible with the social function of the data. If it were a simple commercial mechanism of trading goods, this would not be possible because the consumer is entitled to a different type of protection. I think that the workers only have benefits from blockchain due to the certification of transparency, but I cannot quote concrete examples on this aspect. Not yet, so to say.
Okay, thank you. In the meanwhile, I have seen that other people have put interesting links in the chat, so please visit the chat. Are there more questions? I'm going once again through the screens. No, I don't see any hands. Okay, then I will give the mic back to Stefania, who is the project manager. So please, Stefania.
Here I am. Sorry, just a moment. Oh, let me thank you once again. Thank you all the speakers and participants. It has been a high quality panel discussion, which has given us many inputs, and we have taken a step forward, not only in understanding the potential of blockchain for decent working conditions, but also in defining new fields of action for trade unions at national, European, and transnational level. I will share with you the slides given today and will bother you in the future to join the next project activities. I am giving the floor to Ignacio Doreste from the European Trade Union Confederation.
Thank you very much, Stefania. Good evening, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for inviting us, the European Trade Union Confederation, for this for the closing of this session. I wanted to share with you some thoughts of the ETUC with regard to blockchain technologies. They are based on our adopted positions on data strategies, on AI technologies, and on information and consultation of workers. We have been learning a lot throughout the implementation of the project on the potential advantages and the threats of blockchain technologies for workers' rights. I wanted to share with you some of the thoughts, as said, that we have on blockchain technologies. These ideas are coming from, for example, from the previous seminar that you organized. And I will take the title of one of the presentations about hyper-hope. At this previous meeting, there were many colleagues that during the debate, there was a very interesting debate following the presentations. And they were saying, okay, it is clear from the presentations, we heard them. I mean, I prepared these points with information I had from the previous seminars. From the previous experiences which were shown that at this seminar, it was made very clear that blockchain technology presented advantages for employers and consumers. It was not that obvious yet that this technology was going to bring immediate benefits for workers and their representatives. I think that through many of the presentations that we have heard today, it seems that at least in the theoretical level, this can be possible. We have seen, for example, today a lot of examples about the use of smart contracts, which may support workers' demand and power of scrutiny of labor conditions, and this is good. I mean, it's going to invite employers to observe the different articles of a given contract or a collective agreement. There was a very important point which was raised at a previous occasion in the framework of the project, which was about the threat of removing the mediators in the labor and social relationships. So blockchain perhaps is providing for linear solutions which may not consider other aspects that a human mediator, like a judge or a workers' council, may take into consideration. I mean, the labor relationships, industrial relationships are extremely complex. We are also wondering to what extent the undue behavior of a company, if it is validated by a blockchain, to what extent the trade unions will be able to retaliate if the information stated by the technology is proven to be fraudulent. Because we have to take into consideration that there is a point of departure in labor relations, which is the unbalance in the bargaining power between the employer and the workers. So what we don't want is that blockchain is going to reproduce this unbalance in the bargaining power. There is also the danger of circumventing the collective approach of the trade unions in favor of an individual approach. And it was very interesting that we heard today one of the speakers talking about the ecological impact of blockchain technologies. Okay, so we see that it can be a tool to fight against climate change, but the blockchain technology nowadays is also producing considerable environmental footprint. So perhaps I started my concluding the remarks with this rather critical approach that many of us share. These perhaps are more questions that I need to see a statement on this topic. But we believe that blockchain technologies can provide for trade union rights, for labor and human rights. But there are some preconditions. These are a sound industrial democracy at a given company or a sector. The stronger the trade unions at a company, the more available and effective blockchain technologies will serve to the objectives of the trade union action. Also, whenever blockchain technologies are implemented at the working place, social dialogue structures, collective bargaining, information, consultation, and participation of workers are key to provide the necessary support for workers in order to better shape the introduction of these technologies in the company. We have been talking in this last intervention about the advantages of GDPR for the employment dimension. At this regard, workers should receive the clear and transparent information of the purpose and the use of the collection of data. This is key. And at this regard, we believe that a GDPR falls very short when it comes to the informed consent, because considering this already mentioned unbalance in the power of bargaining between the employer and the employee, workers are a bit unprotected when it comes to the informed consent. I mean, the employer can always force a worker to tick the box of the informed consent. I mean, there is not real freedom from the worker when it comes to validate the use of their personal data under GDPR. And that is why we want that informed consent is strengthened with a collective approach through the participation of trade unions and the scrutiny of the data use of workers in the collective structures, the collective bargaining. So as you can see, our approach is really, I would say we are really interested in continue following the advantages that blockchain technology can bring to the world of labor. My opinion is that from the previous seminar, we emerged with some critical questions. With the seminar of today, we have seen many theoretical examples in which blockchain technology can provide for workers, and perhaps now it's high time to start listening to the actual application by trade unions of blockchain technologies in their industrial action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nacho. Now I give the floor to Cinzia Maiolini for the closing remarks. Cinzia is the responsible of the CGIL Labor 4.0 department.
Buonasera a tutti e a tutti, molto interessante.
Good afternoon, everybody. The discussion on this project is very interesting, and we thank Stefania for initiating this project while involving other categories. I will be very short. Let's say that similarly to previous seminars, we can see something very clear. Blockchain is a certification type of technology. I will not try to play down the previous speakers of what the other speakers said and what the international organization said. But when it comes to certification, we need to understand what we are certifying. I'm talking about Mr. Comandini's presentation, who mentioned the wearable devices for workers that not relate only the blockchain theme, but in any case, these devices are mean advancement in terms of security or even safety and healthiness of workplaces, as bargained by our union during the pandemic. A few tools and devices help us verify if contacts with infectious people had taken place. As Mr. Comandini said, there's also a problem of legitimacy. And here I would like to say that what we do as unions, legitimacy is guaranteed when, in compliance with the current laws on this issue, there's an agreement involving social partners and unions in terms of use of data. The same applies to an interesting passage of Mr. Comandini that connects blockchain to the GDPR. And a lot has been said about protection of the environment and other processes such as a smart contract and the degree of well-being for workers. I think the common denominator, and not trivially, what the element should be used in order to certify a process. And I will try to solve this, to answer this question. Let's think about the relationship between the GDPR and the wearable devices mentioned by Mr. Comandini. Each country has its own legislation and regulations. In Italy, in addition to the transposition of GDPR, there's Article 4 of law on this subject, which is called Jobs Act, and it envisages the regulation of controls that can be done on workers. Blockchain technology can help. It is a chain for validation of a few devices, and it can also validate the correctness of controls performed on workers through wearable devices. But what parameters shall we refer to identify a legal control? Well, the parameters that are introduced in the validation process are those to be considered. And who introduces these parameters? Well, these devices need to be compliant with the applicable legislation, but should be bargained with social partners. If this is true, if we establish that technology, both the blockchain and others, if we see that technology helps certify, which we would be able to certify in real life, well, this means that blockchain is meaningful. Where certification processes, rather, go beyond the role of social partners, then we can raise doubts about it. Blockchains are elements, as said by previous speakers, and their presentations were really interesting, I must say, incidentally. And I thank all participants to stick to the time assigned and go beyond. But in any case, it's a complex issue. But I just wanted to say that all presenters identify a secure certification system within blockchain. I mean, for transactions, validation is given. Let's consider the case of Italy. We know that in Italy, blockchain technology has been used in public authorities in order to validate the paths for the acquisition of information. So it's a certification instrument, in short. So what to certify is what interests us as unions. We know only too well that the translation of validation systems into algorithms is risky to the extent that it is unclear to parties what elements are considered in order to validate a transaction or an employment relationship or a given certificate. When partners, in this case unions, when workers' representatives are involved, when unions can interact with counterparties, with employers, about elements to be included in the algorithm for the validation of the blockchain, well, in order to achieve that result, namely non-discrimination, certification of transparency, certification of skills, certification of compliance by employers with all legislative elements, contractual elements, so both first level and second level security regulatory aspects. Well, if this happens, if you can certify that an employment relationship has been correctly concluded through a smart contract, for instance, and that parties want to achieve an employment relationship, and this reference collective agreement is applied to a given sector, that devices will be provided in order to verify conditions of safety at work, etc., with all wage levels considered as well, then the blockchain can be the container of regulated and contractual relationship. And if these values are complied with, then that relationship will be validated. So let me add, but I hope I won't offend everyone's intelligence. I think that blockchain is a tool, is a place where I write things. What is written, what is derived from what I write, is the object of compliance with the standards. Of course, I found it interesting to verify how the application of this technology on various fields tend to simplify a number of steps. In the previous session, a number of slides were introduced on the certification of processes related to agri-food or the textile industry. Here, we saw that a process can be certified, a process that ranges from the planting of seeds or from the input to the output. Well, in that supply chain, you can simply pose conditions. The production should be organic, but the employment relationship should comply with national bargaining of a given country for logistics, storage and distribution. At the end, you can have a label certifying that the product is compliant. When we talk about organoleptic properties, or when we talk about working conditions that enable a seed to become a product, an output, a produce that I find in the supermarket. I thank Stefania for thinking about this project 1 year ago. For unions, the use of technology is an enabling instrument to consider legislations that we already manage, but we only need to make a step forward. The compliance aspects in all sectors, including, for instance, education given to workers, we need to certify that those terms are complied with. These must be the parameters based on which they can be embedded into an algorithm, so that at the end of the day, that we can certify that process can be validated. So we need to be involved in the ex-ante phase in order to add all parameters validating a process of production, distribution, and application in the world of work. So we welcome all contributions in this respect. I mean, make a last comment on the comrade from FAPAC's intervention or speech. Of course, the processes that support transactions are the most visible ones for consumers, but we should also clarify that in this field too, the elements of the validation of the correctness of the transaction are essential. A special focus put by the union I represent relates to other forms of production. When we talk about smart contract, we can talk about a process that can be more democratic and less bureaucratic, but in any case, it needs to consider a professional role which help validate a few transactions. This is an added plus that I would like to add to the equation, because it is part and parcel of the need for consultation or evaluation of elements that make bargaining likely to be validated.
Thank you so much, Cinzia. Okay, we are on time. Ciao a tutti, grazie.
Thank you, everybody,